Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. Well, it must have been months ago, I got an email from Bonnyman Evans wondering if I'd like to have a chat about his grandfather who had won the Medal of Honour on Tarawa in November 1943. Claire had just had his book published, Bones of My Grandfather, Reclaiming a Lost Hero of World War II. It sounded like a good story, but for some reason things kept getting in the way and I kept kicking it down the road. When I remembered and finally got around to looking at it, I can't believe how foolish I'd been. Every Medal of Honour comes with a great story, but for Clay, looking into his grandfather's past, the story didn't stop there. But before we get to that, I'd like to take a moment to welcome all the new patrons who came on board in October. Your support not only spiritually helps me keep the podcast going, but also in a practical way. You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. So what is this Patreon I keep talking about? Well, it's a way of allowing you to help fund me making the podcast by becoming a patron. I don't ask you to give me $50 or $100. What I ask is, if you enjoy the podcast, to agree to give just $1 or $2 or whatever you want to give each month. You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. So Claire, thanks for joining me. Your grandfather is Alexander Sandy Bonnyman. Why Sandy? Sandy haired?
Well, at some point in the book, I make the crack that my dad, so this is my mother's family. My dad used to joke that the Bonnyman's lost the baby name book because they're very traditional. And as he put it, there's only about 5 or 6 allowable names in the family. His father was Alexander, and there had been previous, Alexander, this and that. And so, and all these succeeding versions of Alexander or Alexandra, they all have a nickname to sort of distinguish them. So it's Al, or it's Alex with an IX, or it's Alex with an EX, or it's Sandy, or it's Alec with a C. And I don't know exactly. He certainly had sandy hair, but Sandy Alexander is, that's a diminutive for Alexander. So
there we go. So, who were the Bonnyman family? What's if you're going to win the Medal of Honour? What's the background from which he comes from?
Alexander Bonnyman Sr., his father, came over from Scotland in 1870 at age 2. His father was a bit of a ne'er-do-well. They settled in Kentucky. Alexander was, I take it, something of a very smart young man because he enrolled at the University of Kentucky at age 16. And before he could get his engineering degree, which is what he really wanted to do, his father said, "Nope, I'm sending you back to Glasgow to get your medical degree." And my great-grandfather said, "Nope, I'm not doing that." And so he set out on his own and went to work for the railroads down in Georgia and got some experience, got some exposure to the mining industry. He ended up marrying my great-grandmother, who came from a fairly prominent family in Georgia, the Berry family. They had been former slave-owning plantation family down in Alabama and Georgia and had done very well. My great-grandmother, Frances Berry, was the youngest daughter. She met my great-grandfather and they married when he was down in Georgia. That was a good thing for a lot of reasons, but one of which was that her sister married a man named Campbell who had a mining company. And my great-grandfather, when he got tired of doing the railroad engineering stuff, and engineering, I mean, he was helping design and build. He wasn't driving a train. He went to work for the Campbell Mining Company briefly and decided he liked it. My great-grandmother had some family money, and they bought a company that would become the Blue Diamond Coal Company that would have mines in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. So that is the very, very capsule history. Scottish immigrant, second generation My grandfather was, and then on his mother's side, a colonial family that had held slaves until the Civil War.
Sandy Bonnyman comes along in 1910. Something that strikes me about this, that later on, I guess, before he gets into the Marines, I made a note. He seems to have a sort of real frontiersman life, but he's from relatively well-to-do background. So he does Princeton. It's sort of, from a mine-owning family. Doesn't sort of sit well almost with where he ends up being just before he joins the Marines. I think is where I'm driving at.
I tell people, and I'm not being facetious, I suspect my grandfather was ADHD. He was very athletic. He was very physical. He was smart, but he didn't like sitting behind a desk or putting on a tie or sitting still. His father was quite proper. His mother was also quite proper, but his father was sort of proper in a kind of an old school European way. And his mother kind of indulged his Southern manhood, as I put it. And so he was a kid who grew up very doted upon and just loving to be outside. He was a hunter. He was a fisher. He was an explorer. He was a character, a performer for his sisters and making them laugh. So he always had a giant personality. And to be honest, once he started getting older, he was 6'1". He is the only person in that family, including me, except for two of his nephews, and they got it from their father, who was tall. And he was so different from my very, very staid and stoic great grandfather, and they clashed quite a bit. And that's really partly why he got sent off to private school in New Jersey, where he discovered football. He had not played football down south. And again, I sort of make the argument, it made him, he was almost like this archetypal Southern figure. He was bold and dashing and chivalrous and adventurous and played football. And he also drank a bit and all of that. So he did well enough and played football well enough up there at his prep school in Jersey that he did wind up at Princeton. He was the first of many, many, many Bonnemans to go to Princeton. And I will say here officially that I remain disappointed and baffled that I was not accepted into Princeton. So, I got into some other Ivy League schools and I couldn't for the life of me figure. I figured I'd be a legacy, but no, I didn't go to Princeton.
Proof that name doesn't always carry you through.
Right. Well, I had the grades and everything else to get into, Columbia. So I still don't know what happened, and I probably will have a slight grudge until the day I die.
So he first joins the army in 31, so he will be 21. Now, my assumption is that there will be no need for him to join the army from his background. The world will be his oyster. And I think it's the Army Air Corps he joins. He has a short-lived career.
Here's the thing. If you Google Bonnyman, the first thing that's going to come up is a Wikipedia entry, and it's fine as far as it goes, but it's an inch deep, and it sort of gives you the hero version and doesn't give you the rest of the story. Well, yes, he went to Princeton. That's impressive. He was also kicked out of Princeton because he didn't have good grades, and he was great on the football field, not so interested in the classroom. So, he tried to work for his father, but he didn't like taking orders from his dad, and his dad wanted him to do what he considered some sort of boring thing. So he really set out on his own. And honestly, I say ADHD and I mean it, but you could put it another way and say he was a guy who needed to have adventure. He needed to be stimulated. And so he decided he wanted to be a pilot, and he applied for and was accepted into the Army Air Corps and went to San Antonio, Texas to begin his training in 1932. And he was down there at Randolph Field, Kelly Field down in San Antonio. And he was there for 3 months. And then he was honorably discharged officially for, quote, reasons of flying deficiency. There are legends that our family loves to tell, because they're too good not to be true, that he was such a rascal that he buzzed the towers too closely and he was insubordinate and so forth. I have to tell you, in all my research, I never found any confirmation of that. And the fact that his superior officer recommended him upon discharge as a man of, extremely good character, I suspect those stories are just apocryphal. So, but for whatever reason, he didn't make a good pilot, and that was the end of his first stint in the military after 3 months.
21 and he's out, and that leaves us till, another 10 years to fill in his life. But what amused me was you mentioned, the strange apocryphal story. Then you've got and this is where I got the idea of the Wild West frontiersman. He gets shot in a bar fight, which just sounds so kind of Wild West.
Absolutely. Well, it's a thing that I will tell you that I grew up idolizing my grandfather with good reason, but I didn't know much about him. My family didn't seem to know. We didn't talk much about him, except I saw that medal on my mother's wall and, our wall, and I was very proud. Well, I had a cousin also named Sandy, Alexander Sandy. He said, well, hey, did you know your grandpa got shot in a bar fight in Santa Fe? And I said, no, that is a lie. I was furious. Well, I go back to my mother and I said, yeah, this is what your cousin told me. And she said, well, it's true. Okay, like so many stories about my grandfather, it's kind of true. He was shot in an altercation. It was not a bar fight, and it was not in Santa Fe. He married my grandmother in San Antonio, whom he'd met during his Army Air Corps stint. Then he did sort of bite the bullet and go back to work for his father at Blue Diamond Coal Company. He just wasn't happy. He was a great salesman, but he didn't like it. So after a few years and a couple kids, he struck out for the West, and he ended up getting a lease on a copper mine in Santa Rosa, which is on the desolate, beautiful eastern plains of New Mexico. He settled his family about a 3-hour drive away in Santa Fe, and then he worked down there most of the week. I went down to Santa Rosa. I looked up the files from the old newspaper stories, and what happened was, we don't know what the fight was about, but he'd had a simmering feud with a local rancher for about a year, and at about 5:30 in the morning in the parking lot of a tavern, this broke into some sort of more serious conflict, and the rancher tried to leave, and when my grandfather aggressively followed him, he shot him. And what's remarkable is my mother had recalled that he'd been shot in the leg. Well, no big deal, right? I mean, we've all been shot in the leg. No, he had been shot in the chest. It went through his lung and passed about a quarter inch from his heart, very, very nearly killing him.
Isn't it wonderful how families sort of embellish, misremember stories? And that's such a great story.
It's a great story. I love it. I love my grandfather so much more for having done all this obsessive work and finding out the fullness of who he is. He's a fascinating human being.
If the war hadn't intervened, you kind of wonder where he would have ended up. But when he does when the war breaks out, he volunteers. He's 32. I mean, I'm assuming at 32 he would have been exempt if he wished to be.
Not only just his age, but he was married. He had 3 small children, and he was operating a highly successful copper mine. And as you know, copper was critical to the defense effort. So the truth is, nobody would have expected him to go in. But again, I want to come back to that idea that he was a man of action, and he didn't like sitting still, and he wanted to mix it up, and he wanted to be in the middle of everything. And so he said, I got to be a part of this. But not only that, he could have, with his family's connections, which were considerable, including in Washington, he could have become a naval officer or an army officer and had a great desk job in Washington or wherever. He didn't want that. He thought that was boring. And he said, I'm going into the Marines. He was too old to qualify for the regular officers candidate program.
I was surprised at that.
Yeah. Well, the cutoff was age 27, and they didn't want married guys. And so he said, fine, I'm going in as a grunt. And that's exactly what he did. When he arrived at boot camp in San Diego, he was 32 years old, And he was hanging around with a bunch of 18, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old guys, and they were on the same level. But it didn't take very long for his superior officers to recognize some of the natural leadership qualities that he had and had obviously he'd shown on the football field and elsewhere.
Yeah. And his first posted, I think, their first overseas action is at Guadalcanal with the Marines. That's right, isn't it? How did he perform?
Well, he got promoted. He was made corporal quite quickly, then made a second lieutenant. And when the 2nd Marine Division came into Guadalcanal, the 1st Marine Division and elements of the Army had fought long and miserably and hard since August 42, and they had basically won the battle. So he arrived, I believe, in January. It may have been February. I think it was January 1943 as a 2nd lieutenant, and he was an engineer. He had that background. So his major assignment was to help build a bridge, to supervise the building of a bridge over the Toja River, which is great. He did very well. And it just happened that he and his men also saw their first combat because they were ambushed by some Japanese who were still there, and they ended up killing 3 of them. And that was his first taste of combat. He did very well. He got that bridge built, and he got a little taste of combat, which for my grandfather, being the kind of adrenaline junkie that he was a great thing. He wanted some more of that. He did.
Do any letters home from him at this period survive? Is it easy to pick through how he felt or what he was writing about?
I'll tell you what, I am the luckiest journalist on the planet because I'm lucky enough to have this man as my grandfather, but I'm also lucky to have had family members who were both inveterate, dedicated letter writers and savers. Not only that, my great-grandfather had his secretaries at the coal company copy every letter, not in triplicate, but I'm not kidding you. I have files with 8 copies of every letter. When I started this project back in 2010, I just contacted family members. I said, hey, if you've got anything in your basement, let me know. And I started going through my mom's stuff. Unbelievable treasure trove that I still have. We will be donating them eventually to the University of Tennessee. Unbelievable documentation of his thoughts, his words, his letters to his siblings, to his friends, to his parents, to his wife, and to his children. Unbelievable.
And does he seem flustered, or does he seem to, sometimes people cover things over in letters and just, talk about banalities, or is he expressive about what was going on?
Yeah, of course he had to deal with the censors like everybody overseas, but I'm very impressed at the emotional honesty that he displays in these letters. I mean, sure, some of it is just great stories that you'd expect to see in a Hollywood movie about the guys and the this and the that, but a lot of it is very personal, particularly in his letters to my grandmother. And I didn't know this, but they had some troubles. Both of them probably drank a bit too much, and it was very clear when I started reading the letters that their marriage was not in the best of shape. But I'll tell you what, after being down there, being in New Zealand for many months, experiencing combat in Guadalcanal, going back to New Zealand, getting malaria, this was a man who very honestly, and it's just poured out on the pages of his letters, he wanted to come home and be a different man for his wife and his children. And I mean, I get shivers talking about it because it's just so, it's so moving when I read his words.
And from New Zealand, it's Tarawa, which is the first opposed amphibious assault by US troops. And I'm led to believe that they thought they knew what they were doing, and it's basically all the mistakes come out, and they learn very quickly from this. So, when did he land? What did he find when he came ashore, or what would he have found?
Yeah, just to spin back just a little bit is I do want to point out, and again, I have this treasure trove of letters from his Marine buddies to my family, and I get to going over the course of years from 1944 to 1960s. their reminiscences and so forth. And they were all told that this was going to be no problem. The Navy had been bombing the heck out of this island. There would hardly be any resistance. They'd go ashore. It'd be no problem. That was not the case. It was, there were many, many complicating factors that led to 1,100 American forces being killed in 76 hours, along with about 5,000 Japanese, which is a horrific death toll. 6,100 people in 76 hours is astonishing when you think about it. And he went ashore. He was not in the initial waves because he was a first lieutenant by then and in charge of a pioneer company, which meant engineers. So, these were the guys that were flamethrower, demolition, so forth. But their initial job in his assignment was going to be shore party, which meant they were going to come ashore and they were going to get supplies to the forward lines. That was their job. And one of the disasters of this, I'm sorry to skip back, but was that they should have known, the Americans should have known, because the Kiwis who'd been there told them this was a bad day to try to do this because it was a neap tide. And that means the lowest high tide of the year. The Americans didn't listen. They went ahead. And what happened was these Higgins boats, transports, got hung up on the reef because there wasn't enough water. There wasn't enough water to cover the draft of the transports. And hundreds of Marines had to wade 600 to 800 yards fully laden into Japanese fire, and hundreds of them never even made it ashore. My grandfather did make it ashore. He was on a Higgins boat, not an LVT. When he got there, and I know this from documents that I was able to find, the pier, the Japanese pier where they had planned to unload supplies, was still in terrible condition. There was still some Japanese resistance and fire. And so essentially they sent a guy forward and received orders from Colonel Shoup, who was in charge of the battle. And he said, listen, you guys set up a defense perimeter on the beach and I want you to pick up injured guys. So that's really what he did from about 4:30 in the afternoon on D-Day through the night. And then the next morning he helped clear, or sometime during the night, he helped clear that pier eventually. And he organized his shore party and so forth. And then some books have claimed that he sort of abandoned his post, and that is not true. You can read the after-action report from his commanding officer. He did exactly what he was instructed to do. And at one point, because of his expertise in demolitions, he was ordered to go forward. It wasn't really even forward. It was down on the beach to Major Henry P. Jim Crow, because there was a huge bunker, sand-covered, coconut log-covered bunker. They had no idea what was underneath there. The naval bombardment had not reduced that emplacement, and they needed to move forward. It was really the one part of the island. There was one other small pocket of resistance, but it was the major part of the island where the Marines were not making progress. So he was sent forward to talk to Major Crow about what are we going to do to take this bunker and clear this and finish this damn thing.
That's the blockhouse. But just before we get there, I was going to say, you've been to Tarawa, and I just before I got you on the call, I thought I'll just look it up on Google Earth. And firstly I was surprised that it's not an island, is it? It's a atoll. Tarawa
is an atoll. It's about 18 miles or 30 kilometers long. It is sort of in the shape of a sideways, a check mark, if you will, a Nike swoosh. And Beisho, the island where the battle took place, is the terminal western island of that atoll. It is about 1 square kilometer, maybe 2.5 miles long, 700 yards wide at the widest, and then quite narrow in other places. It is a tiny, flat little piece of sand where this battle took place. Yeah, and that is where the Japanese had built an airfield.
I was completely ignorant to that fact. I had visions of a much bigger island, and it's not. It's a tiny piece of land that they're struggling to make headway.
I don't know. We'd have to go do this, but it wouldn't surprise me to find out that, inch per inch, more people were killed on Beisho per square inch of land or square foot of land than any other battle in World War II. And I actually think there's a good chance that might be true. Yeah, this crazy thing. There were no caves like Iwo Jima. There were no mountains, like Okinawa, no cliffs, flat piece of sand, coconut trees, and all these heavily, heavily fortified Japanese emplacements.
And there's a particular blockhouse that seems to be key to the defence in the sector where Sandy is, isn't there?
Yeah, there was this huge mound. So they knew something was under there. They knew there was a structure. The Japanese had covered it with sand and coconut logs. The naval bombardment had done nothing to reduce that. And there were 3 machine gun positions, one on top and 2 very close by that. And essentially they had interlocking fields of fire, which meant that every time the Marines in that sector, so it was kind of it was Red Beach 3, it was sort of the easternmost of the beaches where they had come ashore. Every time the Marines tried to push forward, they got slaughtered because there were 3 machine guns that just tore them apart. The battle was going well elsewhere by day 2, day 3. They knew they couldn't, it wasn't like you could just go around this. So they knew they had to capture this, whatever it was, under a big pile of sand. And that's really where my grandfather came in. I mean, he was sent forward and he spoke to Major Crow. I've been so privileged. I've gotten to speak to men who were there. Many of them have died, obviously, the Tarawa, but these guys contacted me in many cases after seeing me on TV. And I talked to a guy who was in intelligence, headquarters company intelligence, who remembers, now he could be wrong, but this is quite a memory, listening to my grandfather talk to Major Crow, and Major Crow said, "Hey, I think this is an ammo dump. I don't think we can use explosives. I think it's going to kill us all." And my grandfather, according to this guy, Marvin Shepard, said, "No, I've worked with explosives. I'm telling you, they would never build an ammo dump this close to the water, and I think we should use explosives." And that's really the plan he ended up crafting, was to use explosives and flamethrowers to get up top that thing and blast away inside.
And did they at the time refer to it as a forlorn hope, which is it's an old British saying. I know it from being familiar with the Napoleonic Wars. The forlorn hope was the men rushed through holes in walls on siegings. So it's very much a forlorn hope of them trying to rush a blockhouse with flamethrowers and high explosives.
And Forlorn Hope has a great history, not in just British military history, but it's also an expression. I love this because I'm a book guy, that's used in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And I'm told, in my research, I learned that it goes back to the Dutch, and it meant verloren hoop, which means lost troop. And I just love that. So first of all, the other 2, the nearby machine gun emplacements were taken out by a shell from a ship in the lagoon, and number 2 was taken out by a tank. But that guy on top the bunker, they still had to deal with. And he said, "We're going to go in there with flamethrower, explosives. We're going to take that guy out. When we get on top, there are some ventilation shafts, and we're going to drop TNT down there, and we're going to fire napalm essentially down there, and we're going to drive whatever enemy is inside out, and we're going to take them out." So essentially that was the plan. They set up machine gunners on the doors to the structure, which were facing south and facing east. I was privileged when the man who was the main gunner on that south door called me after we buried my grandfather in 2015 and told me exactly what he saw. So my grandfather led the way with 2 guys, one with a flamethrower. They got up top. They were able to take out the gunner on top. And once they got on top, those guys' job was to begin dropping TNT satchels down the ventilation pipes. And John Borich was to fire the flamethrower down inside. That was the plan. In the meantime, my grandfather went to the forward edge of that bunker, armed only with his M1 carbine.
The plan works as far as the Japanese are flushed out of the bunker.
Yes, absolutely. There were, as it turns out, they didn't know this, but the facility housed a generator. So it wasn't really meant to be a troop facility. But because the Japanese were being routed, about 150 Japanese Marines, Riko Sentai, were in there, many of them injured. But when that horrible rain of fire came down through those ventilation pipes, they didn't have any choice but to head for the exits. They did that. They turned around and they started charging up the slopes toward the one guy they saw up there. And again, the gunner on the south door, who was at that time lieutenant, he ended up being a colonel, Roy Elrod. He watched this happen. They went up that slope. My grandfather stood there with his rifle and took out as many as he could before he was killed.
What I find amazing about this is there's actually photographs. Is it a combat photographer at the time taking pictures in and around this time of the area, isn't there? So when you're talking about it, I can picture those photographs that are in some which are in the book, aren't they? And you suddenly think, oh God, it's quite bleak.
It's astonishing to me that here's this story. And again, my family, we hardly knew any details until I started digging into it. There was a Marine Corps photographer who was fascinated by my grandfather's booming Southern voice and his presence. And he started following him around and taking photos. And Norm Hatch was we would call him video, but he was shooting film. He was a cameraman standing at the back of that bunker when the assault began. And so if you go to YouTube and look up a film, won the Oscar in 1945 for Best Documentary, called With the Marines at Tarawa. It's about 20 minutes long, and somewhere around 9.5 minutes, 9:40, you're going to see a shot of three guys. It's a little blurry, going up what looks like a sandy hill. The guy on the right in the beginning of the shot is my grandfather. By the end of the shot, the guy with the flamethrower has moved over, so the end of the shot, my grandfather's in the middle. That had to have been taken within minutes of his death on the other side of the bunker. And I just find it astonishing that record exists.
Absolutely incredible. It's sort of the holy grail to be able to actually find relatives on film.
Yeah. And I'm told, I've never had this confirmed, but I've been told that as far as people know, this is the only instance of a Medal of Honor recipient being filmed in the midst of the action for which he was awarded the medal. That's what I've been told.
That will come as no surprise. So the citation for these things is always remarkably short. I think you say it's 395 words. I'm curious to, at the time, how much were your family aware beyond the citation of what had gone on? How much is a family told about? Because it's not just an ordinary death is a Medal of Honor death. I don't know. I presume they get told more than just a telegram that your loved one is killed in action.
I don't think that's correct. I think they were given scant information until they received that. My mother was 12 at the time, and she received that medal. And they had other citations previous to that sort of detailed his actions. But I'm going to tell you very honestly, one of the interesting things about this family was, very proper sort of Southern family, Scottish, very proper older Scottish man. And I don't think it was conscious, but this family was shattered by the loss of this man, their oldest son. And I think there was just a kind of a quiet, tacit decision that we don't want to peel off the scabs on this. We're just going to live with the memories we have and what that citation says. And so I'll be real honest with you. When it finally occurred to me, and I went to my mom and I'd heard a little bit of stories and I went to her younger sister and I went to cousins and, and nobody knew anything. So it was really almost as if my family was so wounded by this loss. It really was painful for them. And it really affected my mother's family that I think they just kind of put my grandfather in a silver suit of armor, mounted him on a white silver charger, and put him behind glass. And we were all content for 6-7 decades to just know that he was a hero. But we didn't know a lot of the specifics.
It's amazing because you do just sort of assume that that a lot must get written and passed to the family when such a medal is given. You'd have thought there'd be a big fuss about it, and you'd know in minute detail.
There was a fuss, in a sense, in that my great-grandfather and great-grandmother desperately wanted to get their son's remains and to bring them back and bury them in Knoxville, Tennessee, where they lived. I mean, this was paramount to them. This was extremely important. But as far as the details of what had happened, they were extremely grateful. And I, decades later, am extremely grateful to have these letters from his buddies in the Marine Corps who wrote and said, hey, I was there, or hey, I wasn't there, but I was with him on the ship before we attacked on Tarawa, and here's what he said. And, you know, they had all these memories, but publicly, and what they passed on to the rest of the family, more or less, I feel like we were content to just have him be the great hero of the family. And it wasn't really necessary to know a lot of details. So honestly, we didn't. My mother told me in 1976 that he'd been buried as an unknown in the Punch Bowl in Hawaii. My auntie, who lives in Hawaii and is my mother's younger sister, she told me, well, I didn't really know. I just thought he'd thrown himself on a grenade or something. So quite remarkable, really. But it's also in keeping with this family, which was rather upper crust, rather blue-blooded, not the kind of people who were going to air, you know, they didn't necessarily want a lot of details.
You bring up the body there. I mean, is he in Hawaii? Was he in Hawaii? Did anybody really know? I mean, it's bitter fighting. Were bodies actively retrieved from? I believe American, unlike the British, there's not. We tend to bury them in where they fell.
Bury them where they fall. Yeah. I think that's a great tradition. Yay, go Great Britain. Good for you. Here's the thing. That battle was ferocious. Many of the men died in the water. There was no time to bury anybody until 3 days later when the fighting had largely ended on Bayshore. By that time, as you can imagine, those who'd been killed early in the battle, which was most of them, and those who'd been in the water were in quite horrible condition. Navy construction battalions came ashore. They dug trenches. They wrapped these guys in their ponchos because, let's face it, that was pretty gross. They didn't do anything. They laid them in trenches, did their best to mark the graves with dog tags so they could come back, and they did their best. But the 2nd Marine Division was gone 4 days after the battle. Gone. All the men who'd participated in those burials were gone, and there was a job to be done. They had to rebuild that airfield. So when Army Graves Registration came back in 1946, they did not have the technological tools that we have today, and they were only able to locate roughly half. I'm going to say it's unclear exactly, but probably at least 100 or so men were buried at sea who were killed in the battle. So we're going to figure, 900 to 1,000 were buried somewhere on the island. They were able to recover about half. The rest of them, they just couldn't find. That's fine. I understand that. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have the means. What's not quite as fine to me is the fact that, and I present this in the book, the letters to my family with every different story in the book. They just couldn't come out and say, hey, it was chaos. We don't know where he is, but he's buried somewhere on this island. They said, oh, he was probably buried at sea. Oh, he was probably buried as an unknown in Hawaii. Oh, he was buried in a memorial cemetery. Don't worry about it. My great uncle was told, oh, they'd all been bulldozed into the sea and sharks had eaten them, etc. All of those stories, who knew what to make of them? My family continued to try to find out the truth. And my mother, bless her heart, probably should have known. I don't want to say probably. She should have known. I found a letter to her in the 1970s saying, hey, very honest for the first time from the Department of the Navy. These guys were lost. We didn't know. He's still buried down there. And yet 3 months later, she was telling me, standing in front of the Punch Bowl, the National Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii, Well, your grandfather's here somewhere. His name's on a wall, but he wasn't there. He wasn't there. And I didn't know it until 2009. I had no idea.
The second part of your grandfather's story is locating him. And I was staggered how much the American government spends on finding and repatriating ex-servicemen. And I think you stated it's 300 million a year, or was.
That's the budget now for the agency, which is known as the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, has a $300 million budget. Now, when I started this business back in 2009, 2010, there were two sort of competing bureaucracies, and the budget was about $100 million a year, which is still a lot. Yeah, I'll be real honest. Almost all the focus was on Vietnam. So there were, maybe 15, 16, 1,700 MIAs in Vietnam, and that's where virtually all the effort went. Not to the approximately 8,000 American forces who were MIA in Korea, and not, this number will astonish you, to the roughly 80,000 MIAs, missing in action, meaning they're dead, but we never found their remains, from World War II. Now, the asterisk there is that probably half of that 80,000 or so, that's approximate, they probably went down with ships or planes in or under the ocean, and a few may be recoverable. But so that still leaves, nearly 40,000 buried somewhere, and nobody knows. So yes, the U.S. government has this agency that in the process of my writing this book got slapped by Congress and reorganized. And here's the thing. Hey, more power to them, because they're doing good work now. The reorganization was a great idea. They're doing excellent work finally after all these years. But man, when I get in trouble, I would like to be punished with a $300 million budget. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't that be great? Like, they tripled their budget. They spanked them, they reorganized them, and gave them 3 times as much money. But I gotta say, I want to give credit. They're doing a great job, and they are being smart, and they continue to locate and identify hundreds and hundreds of remains. Now, that's the government agency. My effort to find my grandfather, I realized after kind of taking a look at the lay of the land, I decided to hitch my cart to a little nonprofit named History Flight out of Florida that was really putting the focus on Tarawa. And that was just really one of the greatest decisions I ever made in my life, because on a budget of, I don't know, $6 to $8 million, they wound up recovering not just my grandfather, but 45 other guys from a cemetery of which there'd been no trace since 1943.
See, that's, you look at the budget, 6 to 8 million versus 300 million. You'd have thought with 300 million over, years, you'd have had everyone home by now.
Yeah, well, again, I want to say, because I believe this in my heart, they're doing a much better job. They're doing a great job. They are being smart. They are finding and identifying guys that they should have identified 40 years ago, but they're doing it now. But yeah, that's a lot of money to bring home. They were hitting 60 in a good year, maybe 80 sets of remains. And at this point, History Flight, we at History Flight work cooperatively with this agency now, and that's very important, and we have a great relationship. We have identified for ourselves about 120 individuals from Tarawa. Now, we can't legally identify, so we do all our identification, we do all the archaeology, we do all the recovery, all the reporting, photography, and then we turn those remains over to the agency, and they are the only ones legally empowered by Congress to make a legal identification. But I can tell you, we've never been wrong. So we've got a great track record.
The key to this is cemetery 27, where your grandfather was. How did you find out? How did you figure out from him being in the sea, lost? How did you know? How did people know to look for cemetery 27?
So Mark Noah is the guy who started this organization, History Flight. And it really wasn't started, that's why the name is so kind of incongruous. It wasn't started as an MIA recovery organization, but that's what we do now. And Mark was volunteering for another recovery organization. They were looking for a plane in Tarawa Lagoon back in, I think, 2006, maybe 2007. He's a pilot. And while he was on the island, somebody there told him, hey, yeah, there's probably hundreds of guys buried here. Well, he just he got intrigued and he went back to the U.S. and he hired an archival researcher and he did a bunch of research himself, and they spent hundreds of hours in Washington and Quantico, Virginia. And they started figuring out what documents they needed to find, and they ended up pulling hundreds and hundreds of what we call casualty cards. These were literally index cards that were created at the time with a manual typewriter saying where people were or whether they'd been recovered. And Mark collected all these, and he said, holy cow, there are hundreds of guys that are still left on this island. Well, on those casualty cards, some of them said, we got no idea where they are. But some of them, there were hints and clues that this person was buried in this cemetery number X, or the various names and so forth. And Mark also came across some documentation, including a photograph, that there had been a big memorial placed with a big cross and a bronze plaque way, way back in, I think, 46, maybe before, listing the names of 24 men and 16 unknowns, so 40 altogether, who were buried supposedly underneath this giant cement cross. And my grandfather's name was on that list. And that turned out to be Cemetery 27, which I learned in my reporting was the only one of the named or numbered cemeteries that no trace of which was found in 1946. They never found anybody. They dug all around that cross. They dug to 7 feet deep. And even the Navy chaplains who had supervised the burials came back. They couldn't find it. They found hide nor hair of Cemetery 27. So it was gone.
How do you go around trying to find a lost grave site? I mean, it sort of seems it's a relatively small island. Someone must have some vague idea where it presumably was.
Yeah. Well, thanks to Mark's research and the photographic evidence, History Flight was aware that it had to be very north on the island and in the central part of the island, somewhere near where the Japanese pier had been. We knew it was somewhere near there. But here's the thing, and I didn't know this until I got working with them. In archaeology, if you miss something by an inch, you have missed it by 10,000 miles. And it's very easy to do that. So Mark knew the general area where he wanted to search, and he basically brought in every single, even sometimes crazy experimental technology, but every single established technology, ground penetrating radar, remote aerial vehicles, GPS, everything he could, including I'm a dog person, and there's a really great dog named Buster, who was a Labrador Retriever, who had been trained to detect the chemical signature of decaying human remains under the ground. And I have to tell you, Buster was never, ever wrong. He was never wrong. He was put on false scents and everything, and he always got it right. But so Mark identified a number of areas that he thought were promising, because essentially through all these tools, there were indications, whether it was the dog's nose or the radar, that said, there is a subsurface anomaly here. So he mapped those out. He said, these are places where I think we should be looking for Cemetery 27 in the general area.
That whole dog thing, I find it amazing. How do you just train a dog to do that? Absolutely fantastic.
It is amazing. Good old Buster. His handler, Buster died in 2016, unfortunately, but his handler was a cop, a police officer in California, and he trained this dog, who ended up working on a number of very high-profile cases, to only alert, and his alert was as soon as he smelled that particular chemical signature of decaying human remains under the ground, he would lie down, and he'd mark that spot, and damn, if every time we didn't go digging there was something there. It might not have been a complete set of remains, or when they looked in California, or he trained him in Old West cemeteries in Nevada. So this dog was able to pick up that scent 4 feet of sand 70 years after those guys had been buried. Really amazing.
Now, you were there when History Flight uncovered your grandfather, when they found his grave. How did that feel? That must have just been spooky.
It was an astonishing moment, but I'll be really honest with you. Mark had done such incredible, careful research, and Kristen Baker, our lead archaeologist at the time, had been so confident that once they found this trench and she began making provisional identifications of each set of remains based on the careful research they had done, she was extremely confident. She said, listen, we know that your grandfather, of these 40 men buried here, should be in space, if you will. They're just laying next to each other. There's no actual grave, all in a trench, but he was number 17. She said, I fully expect we're going to find him in number 17. Well, I'll tell you what, I knew that anything could happen there. People dug trash pits, or somebody had dug a sewer line, and I was nervous. And I was there, I was shooting video, taking photographs for History Flight. I was working in the lab every day, cleaning bones of the guys that we'd recovered and helping out. And honestly, I had a lot of days to really think about it. It was hard for me to fathom. It had been so many years. And every time Mark and I talked, I was like, well, hey, this is needle in a haystack. And chances are your grandfather really was buried as an unknown in Hawaii, and we're not going to find him. So what I say is this. It was an astonishing moment, but I'd also had a lot of days and a lot of years to really think about what it might be when we came to that moment. And when we came to that moment and Kristen was able to identify some gold fillings in my grandfather's teeth, I wanted time to stop, because I didn't want people looking at me. I didn't want to be anybody's show. My heart was going, and I couldn't believe it. And I said, I cannot stand here and, fall apart. So I made a decision that I'm going to be a journalist. That's what I was trained to do. That's what I was hired to do. I put that video back to my camera. I started interviewing Kristen. But here's the thing. I'd had a lot of moments thinking about this. And the next morning, 2 days later, after we got my grandfather out, I went back over there to his empty grave in the morning by myself. And I sat down in there, and I really let myself feel what it meant that here I was, his grandson, sitting on the ground where he had rested for 71 and a half years. And it was a powerful, intense moment, and the likes of which I've experienced very few times in my life.
I cannot begin to imagine how that must have felt. And when they bring up the remains, were they buried? Were they stripped? Was it just? I mean, does anything else come up with them?
What's really interesting to me is that in doing this work and being so successful, History Flight has kind of inadvertently revealed a whole new area of study, because most of these men were killed early in the battle. Their remains were in terrible condition. You can imagine, tropical heat, when they were buried. So what the Marines did was they wrapped them in their ponchos, and they buried them that way because you didn't want anything to do with them. That's a terrible thing to say, but here's the thing. My grandfather was killed very late in the battle. He was not wrapped in a poncho, and his remains were there was very little with his remains. Now, those guys that were wrapped in ponchos were wrapped with helmets, canteens, ammunition, anything you can imagine. And we even found, because this poncho environment created a microenvironment that preserved soft tissue and soft things, we found a pack of Camel cigarettes, hair, skin, leather, brain tissue, but the bones are very brittle. In my grandfather's case, because he wasn't wrapped in a poncho, it was mostly just his skeleton, and they were in very solid shape. we did the rubber soles of his boots were there. And there were a couple of very, very interesting little bits of, as we call it, material evidence, but artifacts that we did find with him. One of which was a lump of metal that I found underneath what would have been kind of his left front hip pocket. And it turned out to be his Zippo lighter. And Mark Noah had a hydrolyzing bath, and he was able to get the corrosion off. And this thing looks pretty good. And you could see that my grandfather had scratched his initial on there. So that is astonishing. Remarkable.
I mean, that is kind of the icing on the cake. It's just unbelievable.
And the wick was even there and in good shape. I tried to light it, but apparently the fuel was no longer good. It wouldn't.
Did the recovery of his body prove or disprove anything of Standy's story?
There was a very consistent narrative of what had happened up there atop the bunker for many, many years. And then in 1995, a guy who unfortunately is no longer living, but a guy I liked a lot, and he wrote a pretty darn good book, a very detailed book about the Battle of Tarawa. Unfortunately, he decided to privilege the recollections, the 50-year-old recollections of one man over everything that had come before. And in the process of that had really, in my mind, undermined my grandfather's story and the unbelievable bravery and courage of what he had done. Well, as you can imagine, as his grandson, I was never that comfortable with that. And part of my research into his story was wherever the evidence led, I was going to go, whatever it said. I did everything I could to try to piece together what really happened. And I think I substantially answered that question. But here's the thing. I felt very confident about what I had learned. But when we exhumed my grandfather's remains, brought him back to the lab, cleaned up those bones, dried them, documented them, it proved to be absolutely indisputable physical evidence that what that guy had reported in 1995 was not true. And that was, I will say, and I will always say, the very most gratifying thing about all the research and all the effort. Because if it had proved that, my grandfather hadn't really done what he'd done and maybe he didn't deserve the Medal of Honor or something, I would have reported that because that's what I do. But his physical remains left no doubt, and that was extremely gratifying. He deserved that medal.
Now, I have one last question for you. So when are you starting the book about Gordon Bonnyman's war? I mean, Burma and India.
Yeah, well, so my grandfather had a much younger brother, 9 years younger, named Gordon. And Gordon, it's sort of ironic. I think my grandfather and I would have gotten along very well. Because the truth is, I, like he, have always been a bit impetuous and kind of done what I'm going to do. And I've done scandalous things or things that scandalize the family and, this and that and, taste for adventure. And every way that my grandfather sort of disappointed his father, his younger brother, Gordon, absolutely stood to the test. And Gordon went to Princeton and not only graduated, but he graduated ROTC and was sent to the China, Burma, India theater, where he ended up helping to train Chinese nationalist troops to resist the Japanese. And he was there in the jungle with Merrill's Marauders, which is actually a very famous U.S. Army unit who did some incredible heroic things themselves. And my great uncle Gordon, who died in 2004, was highly decorated himself. He won a Silver Star and a Bronze Star, Purple Heart. And he came home from the war himself badly affected by the war. He had had terrible malaria. He'd spent, I think, a couple months in Calcutta in a hospital. And then he wound up in Nashville in a hospital. And, he had what we would now call PTSD. He was just not ready to come back to real life. So he ended up going to My grandfather Sandy's wife's family had a ranch in northern Mexico, and Gordon went there to recuperate. And Gordon, when he had recuperated, he came back. He took over his father's company and took it to unbelievable heights of success. And not only that, his poor father was just devastated that he'd never been able to find out about Sandy's remains and where they were and bring him back. My great uncle took up that effort. And I've got all the letters of how hard he tried. And finally, he was bitter too, because he knew he'd been lied to and he just didn't understand and everything. And so the tragic thing is, all those people, my great-grandparents, my two great aunts, and my great uncle all died not knowing that Sandy was buried on Tarawa, on Bayshore Island, and they never got to see what I got to see, what my mother got to see, what all of us cousins got to see, what my auntie got to see, which was to fulfill my great-grandparents and my great-uncle's greatest wish, and that was bring Sandy Bonnyman to Knoxville, Tennessee, and bury him on the highest, most beautiful hillside in the city, right next to his parents and all his siblings. It was a day that no human deserves to have such an amazing, powerful day, and I got to be part of it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing your story. If anyone would like to read more, the book is Bones of My Grandfather, Reclaiming a Lost Hero of World War II by Bonnyman Evans. It's a very interesting read. You'll skip through it pretty quick. I'll put a link on the website. Don't forget, if you want more World War II, give me a like on Facebook. I do regularly post World War II related stuff, usually in reference to the latest podcast. And if you want to know more about becoming a patron, head over to patreon.com/WW2podcast and watch me tell you all about it. Well, that's it for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.